The morning air on the USMC base was crisp and filled with the usual buzz of activity. Marines moved quickly from one place to another, the sound of boots echoing across concrete paths. The mess hall, the heart of daily life on the base, was already crowded with people laughing, talking, and grabbing their breakfast trays. For most, it was just another ordinary morning. But for one young Marine, today was far from ordinary. She was new to this part of the base, having just transferred from another station, and stepping into this mess hall felt like walking into a world where everyone already knew their place, except her. She moved calmly through the crowd, her uniform crisp and her steps steady. Yet there was a subtle tension in the air. Not because she was nervous, but because everyone around her, from the officers to the enlisted personnel, could sense something different about her. Her presence carried a quiet confidence that made people glance up and whisper, though they didn't know why. There was no flashy display, no exaggerated gestures, just a young woman walking into a room with the kind of self-assurance that made you notice without even trying. As she approached the serving line, a senior USMC officer spotted her. He was a man who was used to commanding attention, whose voice could cut through chatter and whose laugh often made others feel small. When he saw her, he immediately recognized that she was new and assumed she was inexperienced. A smirk formed on his face as he started walking toward her, amusement clear in his stride. This was his moment to assert authority, to make a newcomer feel their place in the hierarchy. As he leaned in to check her ID, he chuckled, expecting an easy, amusing exchange. "ID, please," he said, but there was a laugh in his voice. He glanced at her size, her neat uniform, and the way she carried herself, and a teasing remark was already forming in his mind. The Marine, however, didn't flinch. She handed over her ID with a steady hand, her eyes meeting his with calm precision. There was no hesitation, no nervousness, nothing that would give him the satisfaction of seeing her falter. She had been through challenges before, and it showed in the unshakable way she held herself. Around them, other Marines noticed the interaction. Some had been in the mess hall long enough to recognize the officer's habit of laughing at newcomers, using humor as a way to test them. Others were unsure how this encounter would play out, watching silently, some with curiosity, some with unease. There was an invisible tension hanging in the air. It wasn't just a simple ID check. It was a quiet battle of perception and respect. The officer thought he was in control, but the Marine's calm composure made him pause, even if he didn't realize it yet. She moved through the process with no unnecessary words, no sign of being intimidated. Every small gesture, from how she held her tray to how she returned the ID, was deliberate and controlled. It was as if she knew that in a place like this, your reputation begins the moment you step into a room, and she intended to set the record straight without saying a word. She understood the silent rules of the mess hall. Respect was earned through action, not words, and appearances could be deceiving. As the officer laughed, expecting her to be flustered or unsure, he was met with nothing but steady, focused eyes. That brief moment, a glance, a handover of a card, a calm expression, was enough to unsettle him slightly. It was a small crack in the facade of authority he was so used to maintaining. For a second, the bustling mess hall seemed to quiet in his mind, even though the room was still filled with chatter and clattering trays. The young Marine's presence was impossible to ignore, and it had a subtle weight that he didn't expect. In the background, life in the mess hall continued as usual, but for those paying close attention, something extraordinary was happening. A newcomer, someone he assumed would be easily intimidated, was standing strong, unshaken, and poised. There was no need for confrontation or dramatic gestures. Her confidence alone spoke volumes. Every officer and enlisted person who watched, even if only for a moment, felt a sense of intrigue. Who was she? What experience did she carry that made her so unflappable? By the time the officer returned her ID, his laughter had faded slightly. Though he didn't realize it yet, this interaction was more than a routine check. Something about her hinted at a depth of skill, training, or experience that he couldn't immediately identify. The room returned to its usual rhythm, but a seed of curiosity and perhaps caution had been planted in his mind. This young Marine was not someone to underestimate, and her arrival at the mess hall marked the beginning of an unforgettable encounter that would change the officer's perception entirely. Even though it was just a few minutes, her calm walk through the mess hall, the controlled gestures, and the unshakable confidence left a mark. The small details, the straight posture, the steady hand, the unwavering gaze, created an impression far greater than her words ever could. It was a quiet, understated entrance, but one that demanded attention, respect, and ultimately a reevaluation of assumptions. The officer's laugh still echoed faintly in the mess hall as he leaned closer, expecting some reaction from the young Marine. He assumed she would fumble, her newness showing in nervous gestures, maybe stammering as she handed over her ID. But she didn't. She stood straight, shoulders squared, and handed him her identification calmly, as if she had done this 1,000 times before. There was no hesitation, no flicker of worry, and certainly no trace of fear. That simple act, a small card exchanged between them, was enough to begin shifting the balance in the room. The officer, who had built his career on commanding respect through authority and intimidation, felt a flicker of surprise. His amusement wavered for just a moment as he studied her expression. It was neutral, calm, and professional, but there was something underneath that suggested experience, training, and confidence beyond her apparent age or rank. He tried to mask it with a chuckle, but it came out forced like a sound that didn't fit. Around them, other Marines quietly observed. Some had witnessed newcomers being laughed at, teased, or tested, and they were curious to see how this one would react. The usual atmosphere of teasing and informal hierarchy seemed almost suspended in that corner of the mess hall. It was as if her very presence had put a subtle pause on the usual routine. Everyone noticed the tiny tension between the officer and her, even if no one said anything aloud. The officer leaned back slightly, still smirking, but the smirk no longer carried the same confidence. He tried to regain control of the moment with his words, attempting a few teasing remarks that he hoped would rattle her. "You know, not everyone can just walk in here like they own the place," he said with a light chuckle. "This is a serious environment, and it's not always kind to newcomers." The young Marine responded in the simplest, most understated way possible. She said nothing but met his gaze directly. Her eyes were steady, unwavering, and intelligent, showing that she was listening, evaluating, and fully aware of the situation. There was no challenge in her stance, but there was also no submission. Her calm demeanor spoke louder than words ever could. It suggested discipline, experience, and an understanding of the unspoken rules of military life. Respect is not demanded. It is earned through composure and action. The officer leaned forward slightly, his initial amusement now tinged with curiosity. He was used to commanding conversations, to seeing reactions, to asserting his presence and being acknowledged. But this Marine, she didn't respond to his usual tactics. There was no anxiety, no neediness, no awkwardness. The room seemed to shrink slightly around them in that instant, even though the mess hall itself was bustling with the sound of trays clattering, people talking, and cooks shouting out breakfast options. She handed him her ID with the precision of someone who had been drilled in routine and discipline countless times. But it wasn't just about procedure. There was a subtle message in her movements. She knew who she was, she knew her abilities, and she was confident that her competence would speak for itself. Her calm hand, her steady gaze, her straight posture, they all combined to form a presence that was quietly commanding. The officer cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure, but even he had to admit, internally, that this was no ordinary Marine. Most new arrivals would have shown nervousness or attempted humor to ease the tension. She showed neither. There was no need. She carried an air of quiet authority that made him momentarily second-guess himself. The laughter that had flowed so naturally at the beginning of their interaction had vanished. Other Marines in the mess hall, though pretending to be busy, couldn't help but notice the unusual dynamic. Some exchanged quick glances, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding. A newcomer who could hold her ground so confidently in front of a senior officer was rare. The subtle change in the officer's expression, a flicker of doubt, a pause in his usual swagger, didn't go unnoticed. For those paying attention, it was already clear. This Marine was someone special. The exchange of the ID was brief, but it carried weight. To anyone observing closely, the Marine's calm demeanor and measured movements suggested that she was not just another trainee. She had likely faced challenges far beyond what was typical for someone of her apparent rank and experience. Her silence was not weakness. It was strength. Her composure was not arrogance. It was quiet mastery of herself and the environment. Finally, the officer returned her ID, still trying to maintain a semblance of authority, but the shift in the moment was undeniable. What had begun as a simple ID check, a casual, teasing interaction, had become a subtle but powerful display of respect and presence. The Marine walked away from the counter with the same calm stride she had entered with, unshaken and focused, leaving behind an unmistakable impression that she was not someone to underestimate. The officer watched her go, his earlier laughter gone and replaced by an unspoken acknowledgement of the quiet power she possessed. The moment in the mess hall had been brief, but it had already altered perceptions. The new Marine had made it clear, without saying a single word, that she carried skills, confidence, and composure that demanded recognition. She had turned what could have been an awkward encounter into a statement of presence and capability. And as she moved on to join other Marines at the table, the room began to return to its usual rhythm. Yet the officer couldn't shake the feeling that something extraordinary had just walked through the doors of the mess hall. It was a small moment, easily missed by anyone not paying attention, but for those who noticed, it was the start of an unforgettable story, a reminder that true strength often reveals itself in calm, controlled silence, not loud displays or dramatic gestures. After the brief ID exchange, the young Marine moved away from the counter, carrying her tray with calm precision. On the surface, she appeared like any other Marine, disciplined, professional, and quiet. But there was something subtle about her presence that drew attention. It wasn't the way she carried herself, though that alone commanded respect. It was the hint of something deeper, something unseen but undeniably powerful. Most people around her would never have guessed the significance of what she carried on her uniform, but for those who knew, it would have been impossible to ignore. As she walked toward an empty table, she casually adjusted her jacket, revealing a small, distinct patch pinned neatly on her chest. It was simple, almost understated, but it bore a name that could change everything in a room: Red Needle. For anyone familiar with USMC and covert operations, this wasn't just a decorative insignia. It was a symbol reserved for elite personnel who had undergone rigorous training, completed classified missions, and operated in situations where the stakes were unimaginably high. To the untrained eye, it looked like a normal badge. To the experienced, it was a silent announcement of exceptional skill and lethal efficiency. The officer who had just laughed at her ID now noticed the patch. At first, he thought he might be imagining things. Could it really be what he thought it was? He leaned slightly to get a better look, his amusement fading. Red Needle was a name whispered quietly in certain circles, one that carried stories of precision, intelligence, and missions that were never spoken of outside secure channels. Seeing it up close was rare, almost shocking. And here it was, displayed openly on the chest of the very Marine he had just teased. His mind raced. In a split second, the officer realized that this Marine wasn't a novice at all. She had skills and experience that far exceeded what her age or rank might suggest. She had likely faced situations in the field that most officers could only read about in reports or hear in classified briefings. And yet, she carried herself with complete calm, as if this was nothing extraordinary. That was what made her presence so disarming. She didn't boast, she didn't brag, and she didn't demand recognition. The symbol alone was enough to make the experienced officer pause and reassess. Around them, the mess hall carried on as usual, oblivious to the tension building in that small corner. Marines joked, servers shouted menu options, and trays clattered across tables. But for the officer, time seemed to slow. The laughter he had shared moments earlier felt inappropriate now, almost foolish. He realized that this Marine, who had appeared so ordinary, was someone he should have treated with utmost respect from the very start. The insignia was not just a patch, it was a declaration of capability, discipline, and a history that few could match. The young Marine sat down at a table, her movements deliberate and unhurried. She placed her tray neatly and began her breakfast routine with the same quiet focus she had shown since entering the mess hall. She didn't seek attention, but the officer's gaze remained fixed on her. Each motion she made, each calm breath, reinforced the impression that he had underestimated her. The laughter that had once seemed harmless now felt like a grave misjudgment. For a moment, the officer struggled with conflicting emotions. Surprise, respect, and a touch of embarrassment. His initial reaction of humor had been entirely misplaced. This Marine carried an aura that was impossible to ignore, and the red needle patch was the proof. It spoke of missions where failure was not an option, of skills honed under extreme pressure, and of intelligence and precision that could easily surpass his own experience in certain areas. The realization was both humbling and intimidating. Even though she didn't speak, the young Marine's presence seemed to fill the room. There was a weight to her demeanor, a quiet authority that demanded respect without demanding attention. The officer leaned back slightly, trying to mask the shift in his perception, but he knew that anyone with knowledge of her background would immediately understand the significance of the patch. It was a subtle reminder that appearances could be deceiving. What seemed like a new, inexperienced Marine was, in fact, a highly trained and lethal professional. Other Marines nearby, still unaware of the true meaning of the insignia, noticed the officer's sudden pause. Some exchanged curious glances, sensing the unusual tension but not knowing why. The dynamics of the room had subtly changed. Where moments ago the officer had been the dominant presence, now he was the one reassessing, the one wondering how he had misjudged someone so profoundly. The young Marine, for her part, remained completely composed, unaffected by the attention. Her calmness was not arrogance, it was confidence born of experience. By the time she had finished adjusting her jacket and quietly continued her breakfast, the officer had come to a silent understanding. The insignia was more than just a patch. It was a symbol of unmatched skill, courage, and discipline. He could no longer see her as just another Marine. She had silently asserted herself, not through words or confrontation, but through presence, calm, and the quiet authority of her badge. This brief encounter, though small in the grand scale of the mess hall's daily routine, had shifted the balance. The officer's laughter had vanished, replaced by awareness and respect. The Marine, unaware of the internal change she had triggered, continued her breakfast, leaving a lasting impression. That true skill often does not announce itself loudly, but when it reveals itself, even the most confident can be taken aback. The officer couldn't take his eyes off the Marine. The brief moment when he had noticed the red needle insignia kept replaying in his mind. What he had initially thought was just a simple ID check had now turned into a silent revelation. The laughter that had escaped him earlier felt foolish, almost inappropriate. For the first time in a long time, he found himself unsure, questioning the assumptions he had made about someone who, on the surface, appeared to be a mere newcomer. He shifted slightly, trying to gather his thoughts. That patch, the small emblem she carried, was not just a symbol of skill. It was a mark of elite training, of missions so secretive that even he, as a senior officer, had only heard about them in briefings or rumors. Seeing it up close, knowing it belonged to someone standing in front of him, brought an uneasy realization. This Marine had experience and expertise that surpassed the casual assessments he was accustomed to making. The calmness she displayed wasn't normal for someone her apparent age or rank. It was the confidence of someone who had been tested in situations most could never imagine. For a moment, he replayed the encounter in his mind. The way she had handed over her ID without hesitation, the steady gaze that met his own, and the precise, controlled movements as she adjusted her jacket. All of it now made sense. These weren't the actions of an ordinary Marine. They were the marks of someone trained to remain calm under pressure, someone whose body and mind were conditioned for high-stakes situations. The officer's initial amusement had been completely misplaced, and the weight of that realization pressed heavily on him. The Marine, meanwhile, carried on with her breakfast as if nothing had happened. She didn't look around to see who was watching or gauge reactions. She didn't need to. Her presence alone commanded the attention and respect she required. It was subtle, almost invisible to those who didn't know what to look for, but powerful to those who did. Her calmness was not weakness, it was strategy. She understood that respect, once earned, speaks louder than any boast or confrontation ever could. As the officer observed her, he felt a mixture of awe and apprehension. He had spent years in the Marine Corps, interacting with countless personnel, many of whom were skilled and disciplined. But there was something about her, something intangible yet undeniable, that set her apart. The insignia she wore was just a hint. The real strength was in her demeanor, the quiet assurance that she carried herself with. It was the kind of presence that could change the dynamics of a room without a single word. He remembered the stories he had heard about Red Needle operatives. Their missions were often classified, dangerous, and impossible for ordinary Marines to even imagine. They were sent into situations where precision, discipline, and absolute control were required. Failure was not an option. And here she was, in the mess hall, calm and unassuming, yet carrying the weight of that reputation on her chest. The realization was humbling. For the first time in years, he felt the need to approach someone with caution rather than authority. Other Marines began to notice the shift in the officer's demeanor, though they didn't understand why. The usual confidence, the smirk, the casual teasing, all of it had disappeared. He sat back slightly, his mind racing, trying to process what he had just witnessed. For the rest of the room, it seemed like nothing had changed. The morning continued as usual, but for him the world had subtly shifted. He had been confronted, not with words or a challenge, but with quiet competence and the unmistakable symbol of elite skill. The Marine continued her breakfast with deliberate care, picking up each utensil, arranging her food, and eating in a manner that was disciplined yet unpretentious. Every movement reinforced the lesson she had already silently delivered. Appearances can be deceiving, and strength is often quiet, not loud. The officer watched, understanding that he had underestimated her in a way that could have been dangerous if he had encountered her in a real operational setting. The awareness brought with it a strange mix of respect, intimidation, and humility. In that moment, the officer realized that his laughter had been inappropriate not just socially but professionally. This Marine was someone who could, without effort, surpass many who relied on rank and authority to assert themselves. She had already commanded his respect without speaking a single word, relying solely on presence, composure, and the quiet authority of her patch. The insignia had been the key, but it was her behavior that had delivered the full impact. By the time she finished her breakfast and prepared to leave the table, the officer had come to a silent understanding. This was not someone to test or underestimate. The lessons of hierarchy, authority, and judgment that he had relied upon in the past suddenly seemed insufficient. He realized that he had been shown something profound, that true capability is often hidden in quiet confidence, and that sometimes the most extraordinary skills are revealed not in grand gestures but in subtle, controlled presence. As she walked away, others noticed the officer's gaze lingering longer than usual. Some were curious, some confused, but none could understand the full significance of what had just happened. For the officer, however, it was unforgettable. He had laughed at her moments ago, expecting the usual response from a new Marine, and now he was confronted with someone whose reputation and skill could not be ignored. In that single encounter, the Marine had reshaped his perception, teaching a lesson in humility, respect, and the quiet power of experience. The room returned to normal, the clatter of trays and chatter resuming, but for the officer, everything had changed. The Marine had shown that strength does not need to announce itself, and that the mark of true skill often comes in the form of quiet confidence, an unyielding gaze, and the subtle display of credentials that carry immense meaning. The encounter would stay with him long after the morning had ended, a reminder that appearances are rarely what they seem, and that true respect must be earned, not assumed. The room seemed ordinary to anyone else. Marines chatting casually, trays clattering, the smell of coffee and eggs filling the air. But in one corner, A subtle shift had occurred that changed the energy completely. The officer who had laughed at the young Marine's ID was no longer laughing. He was frozen, caught in a rare moment of hesitation, as if the usual rules of authority didn't fully apply anymore. Something about her presence, her calm confidence, and the red needle insignia she carried had created a tension that was almost tangible. For the officer, time seemed to slow. Every casual gesture the Marine made, lifting her fork, adjusting her uniform, taking a sip of water, was precise, controlled, and deliberate. She moved with the same confidence that one might imagine in a seasoned operative, someone who had faced challenges far beyond the imagination of those around her. The officer felt a mix of surprise and unease. He had assumed she was a new, inexperienced recruit, someone to tease and test. Instead, she was a living demonstration of skill, calm, and authority, all wrapped in a seemingly ordinary Marine's body. Around them, other Marines began to notice the subtle shift. It wasn't something loud or obvious, but it was there, like a ripple in the room's atmosphere. The officer's body language had changed. His confident posture had softened into something more cautious. Even those who didn't know what the patch meant could feel the sudden gravity in the air. They glanced at him, puzzled by the unusual pause in his usual commanding presence. There was a quiet, almost magnetic energy surrounding the young Marine, a kind of invisible force that demanded attention without demanding it. The officer, usually quick to assert control, now found himself carefully observing her rather than speaking. He realized that any attempt at teasing or asserting authority could be dangerous, metaphorically and perhaps even literally. The Marine's calm, focused demeanor suggested that she was fully capable of handling far more than a simple ID check. Her silent composure was a warning, subtle but unmistakable, that she could operate in situations where most would falter under pressure. Every small action she took seemed purposeful. She didn't glance around the room, she didn't check if anyone was watching, and she didn't seek approval. Her calm and precise movements showed discipline honed through countless experiences, the kind that came only from missions where mistakes were costly and hesitation could be fatal. The officer felt an unspoken acknowledgement forming in his mind. This was someone he could not underestimate, no matter his rank or experience. As the Marine continued with her breakfast, other officers nearby began to notice the change in their peer. The confident, teasing demeanor that had been dominant moments earlier had vanished. Where there was once laughter, there was now a careful observation, a respect that had been earned silently. Some Marines whispered to each other, trying to figure out why the atmosphere had shifted, but no one dared to disturb the young Marine. Her presence alone had become a quiet authority, one that could not be challenged without consequence. The officer found himself reflecting on the moment, replaying every detail. The way she held her tray, the calmness in her eyes, the deliberate precision of her movements. He realized that he had misjudged her completely. Her skills and experiences were invisible to most, yet the presence they gave her was undeniable. The realization left him with a mix of humility and awe. He had laughed at someone he assumed was a novice, and now he recognized that she was anything but. It was not just the insignia, the red needle patch, that had shifted the dynamic. It was the Marine herself. The badge was a hint, a signal of capability, but it was her demeanor that made the moment profound. Her quiet authority didn't demand attention, yet it could not be ignored. The officer understood that, for someone with her training and experience, she could navigate any situation with precision and control. His laughter had been misplaced, his assumptions incorrect. The young Marine had, without a single word, demonstrated a level of skill, discipline, and composure that few could match. For the rest of the mess hall, life continued as normal. People ate, laughed, and talked, unaware of the subtle tension in the corner. But the officer's internal shift was significant. He now approached the room, the Marine, and the situation differently. He understood that respect was not automatic and that misjudgments could have consequences. In his mind, the young Marine had already proven herself, and her silent assertion of authority had left an impression stronger than any words could have conveyed. The Marine finished her breakfast, placing her tray down neatly and preparing to leave. Her movements continued to be calm and deliberate, leaving no trace of stress or tension behind her. As she rose to go, the officer's gaze followed her, and for the first time, he felt an unusual mixture of respect and caution. The lesson of the encounter was clear. Appearances could be misleading, and true strength was often revealed in quiet confidence and controlled presence. The ripple effect of her presence extended even to those who did not understand the significance of the patch. They could sense that she carried herself differently, that she was someone extraordinary, though they could not articulate why. The officer, however, knew precisely what he had witnessed. He had seen a Marine who could operate in extreme conditions, someone whose skills and experiences demanded silent respect. The subtle tension in the room, the shift in energy, and the complete disappearance of his earlier amusement all served as reminders of her unique presence. By the time she left the table and moved on, the officer was left reflecting on what had just happened. He had learned an important lesson about judgment, humility, and the unseen capabilities of those around him. The Marine's silent strength had dominated the moment, and her controlled demeanor had transformed what could have been an ordinary, forgettable encounter into a lasting lesson in respect and awareness. He knew that this brief interaction, though small in time, would stay with him for a long time, a quiet reminder that skill and authority often speak louder than words or rank ever could. By now, the officer had regained a small measure of composure, but the initial tension lingered like a shadow over his usual confidence. He had laughed at her, assuming she was inexperienced, and now he understood how wrong he had been. The realization weighed heavily on him, not only because of the Marine's skills but also because of the silent authority she carried. Her calm, deliberate movements and the subtle display of the red needle patch had completely shifted the dynamics of the mess hall, leaving him both impressed and humbled. He cleared his throat softly and leaned slightly forward, a gesture he rarely made without a commanding purpose. The usual teasing remarks, the humor meant to assert dominance, were gone. They felt out of place now, even awkward. Instead, he returned her ID, his fingers steady but his mind racing with new respect for the Marine before him. It was a small, simple act, but in that moment it carried immense significance. He wasn't just handing back a piece of identification. He was acknowledging a skill, a presence, and a reputation that far exceeded what he had expected. The Marine took the ID calmly without breaking eye contact. There was no smirk, no acknowledgement of the power shift, nothing that would have encouraged the officer to feel superior again. She had already made her point silently. Respect was earned, and she had earned it without a single word of confrontation. The officer realized that she did not need to assert dominance through loud or aggressive means. Her authority was subtle, quiet, and absolute. Around them, other Marines began to notice the change. Some whispered quietly, trying to understand what had just happened. They could see the officer's expression, how his usual confidence had been replaced by careful attention and respect. The young Marine had transformed the room's energy simply by being herself, by being calm, professional, and confident. There was no show of arrogance, no boastful gestures, just a quiet, undeniable strength. The officer's mind raced as he reflected on the incident. He had encountered many skilled Marines over the years, but rarely had someone so young demonstrated such control and presence. The red needle insignia was just a hint of her experience, a symbol that carried weight in the military world, but her actions, her demeanor, and the confidence with which she moved were the real indicators of her capabilities. She was disciplined, focused, and aware of the environment around her in a way that most officers rarely witnessed in new personnel. He realized that his initial laughter had been more than a mistake. It had been a misjudgment that could have had serious consequences if their roles were reversed in a field situation. Her calmness, precision, and silent command suggested that she was capable of handling high-pressure missions that required quick thinking, strategic awareness, and unwavering focus. The officer understood now that underestimating her could have been dangerous. The lesson was clear. Do not judge someone by appearances alone, and always respect the skill and experience others carry, even when it is not immediately obvious. The young Marine, for her part, continued her routine without any acknowledgement of the subtle storm she had stirred. She moved with careful precision, ate her meal in quiet discipline, and arranged her tray neatly when she finished. Her focus never wavered. She didn't need to flaunt her abilities or seek approval. Her calm presence was enough. That was the most remarkable part. She didn't need to prove herself verbally because her actions, posture, and attention to detail spoke louder than any words ever could. As the officer returned her ID and stepped back, a quiet understanding passed between them. It was not spoken, but it was unmistakable. He had been humbled, and he knew it. The laughter was gone, replaced by respect. He had learned something about leadership, about discipline, and about the invisible strength some individuals carry. The Marine had silently shown that authority is not only in rank or position but also in skill, composure, and quiet confidence. Other Marines began to look at her differently. Some who had been curious now understood that this was someone extraordinary. Even without knowing the full story of Red Needle, they could see that she carried herself with the poise of someone who had faced challenges most could not imagine. The officer's transformation, from amusement to respect, served as a signal to others. This Marine was someone whose abilities demanded attention, even if those abilities were hidden beneath a calm exterior. By the time she stood and prepared to leave the mess hall, the officer had fully acknowledged the shift in the room. He understood that respect was not automatic and that it had to be earned, often silently, through discipline, focus, and unwavering confidence. She had done all of that without raising her voice, without confrontation, and without demanding recognition. Her calm authority had commanded the respect of a senior officer and had subtly reshaped the dynamics of the mess hall itself. As she moved toward the exit, the officer's gaze followed her, no longer amused but thoughtful and measured. The incident had been brief, but its impact was lasting. He had witnessed something rare, a demonstration of skill, calm, and confidence so quiet yet so undeniable that it could not be ignored. The lesson was clear: never underestimate someone based on appearances, and recognize that true strength often reveals itself in controlled, disciplined, and silent actions. In that moment, the officer realized that the Marine's presence would stay with him long after she had left the mess hall. She had shown him and everyone paying attention that authority is not given, it is demonstrated. The badge she carried, the Red Needle insignia, was a symbol of her training and experience, but it was her calm composure and silent confidence that truly earned respect. The encounter, though brief, had left an indelible mark, teaching humility, awareness, and the quiet power of competence.